Again, Sussy has made a small error. It was not I that wrote the song. I heard Billy Rice sing it in the Negro Minstrel Show, and I brought it home and sang it, with great spirit, for the elevation of the household. The children admired it to the limit, and made me sing it with burdensome frequency. To their minds it was superior to the battle hymn of the Republic. How many years ago that was? Where now is Billy Rice? He was a joy to me, and so were the other stars of the nigger show. Billy Birch, David Wambold, Bacchus, and a delightful dozen of their brethren, who made life a pleasure to me 40 years ago and later. Birch, Wambold, and Bacchus are gone years ago, and with them departed to return no more forever, I suppose, the real nigger show. The genuine nigger show, the extravagant nigger show. The show which to me had no peer and whose peer has not yet arrived, in my experience. We have the grand opera, and I have witnessed, and greatly enjoyed, the first act of everything which Wagner created, but the effect on me has always been so powerful that one act was quite sufficient. Whenever I have witnessed two acts, I have gone away physically exhausted. And whenever I have ventured an entire opera, the result has been the next thing, to suicide. But if I could have the nigger show back again, in its pristine purity and perfection, I should have but little further use for opera. It seems to me that to the elevated mind and the sensitive spirit the hand organ and the nigger show are a standard, and a summit to whose rarefied altitude the other forms of musical art may not hope to reach. Dictated September 5, 1906. It is years since I have examined the children's record. I have turned over a few of its pages this morning. This book is a record in which Mrs. Clemens and I registered some of the sayings and doings of the children, in the long ago, when they were little chaps. Of course, we wrote these things down at the time because they were of momentary interest, things of the passing hour, and of no permanent value. But at this distant day, I find that they still possess an interest for me and also a value, because it turns out that they were registrations of character. The qualities then revealed by fitful glimpses, in childish acts and speeches, remained as a permanency in the children's characters in the drift of the years, and were always afterwards clearly and definitely recognizable. There is a masterful streak in Jean that now and then moves her to set my authority aside for a moment and end a losing argument in that prompt and effective fashion. And here in this old book, I find evidence that she was just like that before she was quite 4 years old. From the Children's Record, Quarry Farm, July 7, 1884. Yesterday evening our cows, after being inspected and worshipped by Jean from the shed for an hour, wandered off down into the pasture and left her bereft. I thought I was going to get back home now, but that was an error. Jean knew of some more cows in a field somewhere and took my hand and led me thitherward. When we turned the corner and took the right-hand road, I saw that we should presently be out of range of call and sight, so I began to argue against continuing the expedition, and Jean began to argue in favor of it, she using English for light skirmishing and German for business. I kept up my end with vigor and demolished her arguments in detail, one after the other, till I judged I had her about cornered. She hesitated a moment, then answered up sharply. "Wir werden nichts mehr darüber sprechen, we won't talk any more about it." It nearly took my breath away, though I thought I might possibly have misunderstood. I said, "Why, you little rascal, was hast du gesagt?" But she said the same words over again, and in the same decided way. I suppose I ought to have been outraged, but I wasn't, I was charmed. And I suppose I ought to have spanked her, but I didn't, I fraternized with the enemy, and we went on and spent half an hour with the cows. That incident is followed in the record by the following paragraph, which is another instance of a juvenile characteristic maintaining itself into mature age. Sussy was persistently and conscientiously truthful throughout her life with the exception of one interruption covering several months and perhaps a year. This was while she was still a little child. Suddenly, not gradually, she began to lie, not furtively but frankly, openly, and on a scale quite disproportioned to her size. Her mother was so stunned, so nearly paralyzed for a day or two, that she did not know what to do with the emergency. Reasonings, persuasions, beseechings, all went for nothing. They produced no effect. The lying went tranquilly on. Other remedies were tried, but they failed. There is a tradition that success was finally accomplished by whipping. I think the record says so, but if it does it is because the record is incomplete. Whipping was indeed tried, and was faithfully kept up during 2 or 3 weeks, but the results were merely temporary. The reforms achieved were discouragingly brief. Fortunately for Sussy, an incident presently occurred which put a complete stop to all the mother's efforts in the direction of reform. This incident was the chance discovery in Darwin of a passage which said that, When a child exhibits a sudden and unaccountable disposition to forsake the truth and restrict itself to lying, the explanation must be sought away back in the past. That an ancestor of the child had had the same disease at the same tender age, that it was irremovable by persuasion or punishment, and that it had ceased as suddenly and as mysteriously as it had come when it had run its appointed course. I think Mr. Darwin said that nothing was necessary but to leave the matter alone and let the malady have its way and perish by the statute of limitations. We had confidence in Darwin, and after that day, Sussy was relieved of our reformatory persecutions. She went on lying without let or hindrance during several months or a year. Then the lying suddenly ceased, and she became as conscientiously and exactingly truthful as she had been before the attack, and she remained so to the end of her life. The paragraph in the record to which I have been leading up is in my handwriting, and is of a date so long posterior to the time of the lying malady that she had evidently forgotten that truth-speaking had ever had any difficulties for her. Mamma was speaking of a servant who had been pretty unveracious, but was now trying to tell the truth. Sussy was a good deal surprised, and said she shouldn't think anybody would have to try to tell the truth. In the record, the children's acts and speeches quite definitely define their characters. Sussy's indicated the presence of mentality, thought, and they were generally marked by gravity. She was timid on her physical side, but had an abundance of moral courage. Clara was sturdy, independent, orderly, practical, persistent, plucky, just a little animal, and very satisfactory. Charles Dudley Warner said Sussy was made of mind and Clara of matter. When Motley, the kitten, died, someone said that the thoughts of the two children need not be inquired into, they could be divined. That Sussy was wondering if this was the end of Motley, and had his life been worthwhile. Whereas Clara was merely interested in seeing to it that there should be a creditable funeral. In those days, Sussy was a dreamer, a thinker, a poet and philosopher, and Clara wasn't. In after years, a passion for music developed the latent spirituality and intellectuality in Clara, and her practicality took second and, in fact, even third place. Jean was from the beginning orderly, steady, diligent, persistent, and remained so. She picked up languages easily and kept them. Sussy aged 11, Jean 3. Sussy said the other day when she saw Jean bringing a cat to me of her own motion, Jean has found out already that Mama loves morals and Papa loves cats. It is another of Sussy's remorselessly sound verdicts. As a child, Jean neglected my books. When she was 9 years old, Will Gillette invited her and the rest of us to a dinner at the Murray Hill Hotel in New York, in order that we might get acquainted with Mrs. Leslie and her daughters. Elsie Leslie was 9 years old and was a great celebrity on the stage. Jean was astonished and awed to see that little slip of a thing sit up at table and take part in the conversation of the grown people, capably and with ease and tranquility. Poor Jean was obliged to keep still, for the subjects discussed never happened to hit her level, but at last the talk fell within her limit and she had her chance to contribute to it. Tom Sawyer was mentioned. Jean spoke gratefully up and said, "I know who wrote that book, Harriet Beecher Stowe." One evening Sussy had prayed, Clara was curled up for sleep. She was reminded that it was her turn to pray now. She laid, "Oh, one's enough," and dropped off to slumber. Clara, 5 years old. We were in Germany. The nurse, Rosa, was not allowed to speak to the children otherwise than in German. Clara grew very tired of it. By and by the little creature's patience was exhausted, and she said, "Aunt Clara, I wish God had made Rosa in English." Clara, 4 years old, Sussy 6. This morning when Clara discovered that this is my birthday, she was greatly troubled because she had provided no gift for me, and repeated her sorrow several times. Finally she went musing to the nursery, and presently returned with her newest and dearest treasure, a large toy horse, and said, "You shall have this horse for your birthday, Papa." I accepted it with many thanks. After an hour she was racing up and down the room with the horse, when Sussy said, "Why, Clara, you gave that horse to Papa, and now you've taken it again." "Clara, I never give it to him for always, I give it to him for his birthday." In Geneva, in September, I lay abed late one morning, and as Clara was passing through the room I took her on my bed a moment. Then the child went to Clara Spaulding and said, "Aunt Clara, Papa is a good deal of trouble to me." "Is he? Why?" "Well, he wants me to get in bed with him, and I can't do that with Gelmuls. I don't like Gelmuls anyway." "What, you don't like gentlemen? Don't you like Uncle Theodore Crane?" "Oh yes, but he's not a Gelmul, he's a friend." Mark Twain. To be continued. Footnote. North American Review. Number DCXVI. July 5, 1907. Chapters from My Autobiography, Roman 20. By Mark Twain. 1868. Notes on Innocents Abroad. Dictated in Florence, Italy, April 1904. I will begin with a note upon the dedication. I wrote the book in the months of March and April, 1868, in San Francisco. It was published in August 1869. 3 years afterward, Mr. Goodman, of Virginia City, Nevada, on whose newspaper I had served 10 years before, came east, and we were walking down Broadway one day when he said, "How did you come to steal Oliver Wendell Holmes's dedication and put it in your book?" I made a careless and inconsequential answer, for I supposed he was joking. But he assured me that he was in earnest. He said, "I'm not discussing the question of whether you stole it or didn't, for that is a question that can be settled in the first bookstore we come to. I am only asking you how you came to steal it, for that is where my curiosity is focalized." I couldn't accommodate him with this information, as I hadn't it in stock. I could have made oath that I had not stolen anything, therefore my vanity was not hurt nor my spirit troubled. At bottom I supposed that he had mistaken another book for mine, and was now getting himself into an untenable place and preparing sorrow for himself and triumph for me. We entered a bookstore and he asked for The Innocents Abroad, and for the dainty little blue and gold edition of Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes's poems. He opened the books, exposed their dedications, and said, "Read them. It is plain that the author of the second one stole the first one, isn't it?" I was very much ashamed and unspeakably astonished. We continued our walk, but I was not able to throw any gleam of light upon that original question of his. I could not remember ever having seen Dr. Holmes's dedication. I knew the poems, but the dedication was new to me. I did not get hold of the key to that secret until months afterward. Then it came in a curious way, and yet it was a natural way. For the natural way provided by nature and the construction of the human mind for the discovery of a forgotten event is to employ another forgotten event for its resurrection. 1866. I received a letter from the Rev. Dr. Rising, who had been rector of the Episcopal Church in Virginia City in my time, in which letter Dr. Rising made reference to certain things which had happened to us in the Sandwich Islands 6 years before. Among things, he made casual mention of the Honolulu Hotel's poverty in the matter of literature. At first I did not see the bearing of the remark, it called nothing to my mind. But presently it did, with a flash. There was but one book in Mr. Kirchhoff's hotel, and that was the first volume of Dr. Holmes's Blue and Gold series. I had had a fortnight's chance to get well acquainted with its contents, for I had ridden around the big island, Hawaii, on horseback, and had brought back so many saddle boils that if there had been a duty on them, it would have bankrupted me to pay it. They kept me in my room, unclothed and in persistent pain for 2 weeks, with no company but cigars and the little volume of poems. Of course I read them almost constantly. I read them from beginning to end, then read them backwards, then began in the middle and read them both ways, then read them wrong end first and upside down. In a word, I read the book to rags and was infinitely grateful to the hand that wrote it. Here we have an exhibition of what repetition can do, when persisted in daily and hourly over a considerable stretch of time, where one is merely reading for entertainment, without thought or intention of preserving in the memory that which is read. It is a process which in the course of years dries all the juice out of a familiar verse of scripture, leaving nothing but a sapless husk behind. In that case you at least know the origin of the husk, but in the case in point I apparently preserved the husk, but presently forgot whence it came. It lay lost in some dim corner of my memory a year or two, then came forward when I needed a dedication, and was promptly mistaken by me as a child of my own happy fancy. I was new, I was ignorant, the mysteries of the human mind were a sealed book to me as yet, and I stupidly looked upon myself as a tough and unforgivable criminal. I wrote to Dr. Holmes and told him the whole disgraceful affair, implored him in impassioned language to believe that I had never intended to commit this crime, and was unaware that I had committed it until I was confronted with the awful evidence. I have lost his answer. I could better have afforded to lose an uncle. Of these I had a surplus, many of them of no real value to me, but that letter was beyond price, beyond uncledom, and unsparable. In it Dr. Holmes laughed the kindest and healingest laugh over the whole matter, and at considerable length and in happy phrase assured me that there was no crime in unconscious plagiarism, that I committed it every day, that he committed it every day, that every man alive on the earth who writes or speaks commits it every day and not merely once or twice, but every time he opens his mouth. That all our phrasings are spiritualized shadows cast multitudinously from our readings. That no happy phrase of ours is ever quite original with us. There is nothing of our own in it except some slight change born of our temperament, character, environment, teachings, and associations. That this slight change differentiates it from another man's manner of saying it, stamps it with our special style, and makes it our own for the time being. All the rest of it being old, moldy, antique, and smelling of the breath of 1,000 generations of them that have passed it over their teeth before. In the 30-odd years which have come and gone since then, I have satisfied myself that what Dr. Holmes said was true. I wish to make a note upon the preface of the Innocents. In the last paragraph of that brief preface, I speak of the proprietors of the Daily Alta California having waived their rights in certain letters which I wrote for that journal while absent on the Quaker City trip. I was young then, I am white-headed now, but the insult of that word rankles yet, now that I am reading that paragraph for the first time in many years, reading it for the first time since it was written, perhaps. There were rights, it is true, such rights as the strong are able to acquire over the weak and the absent. Early in '66, George Barnes invited me to resign my reportership on his paper, the San Francisco Morning Call, and for some months thereafter I was without money or work. Then I had a pleasant turn of fortune. The proprietors of the Sacramento Union, a great and influential daily journal, sent me to the Sandwich Islands to write 4 letters a month at $20 apiece. I was there 4 or 5 months, and returned to find myself about the best-known honest man on the Pacific coast. Thomas McGuire, proprietor of several theaters, said that now was the time to make my fortune, strike while the iron was hot. Break into the lecture field, I did it. I announced a lecture on the Sandwich Islands, closing the advertisement with the remark, admission $1, doors open at 7:30, the trouble begins at 8. A true prophecy. The trouble certainly did begin at 8, when I found myself in front of the only audience I had ever faced, for the fright which pervaded me from head to foot was paralyzing. It lasted 2 minutes and was as bitter as death. The memory of it is indestructible, but it had its compensations, for it made me immune from timidity before audiences for all time to come. I lectured in all the principal Californian towns and in Nevada, then lectured once or twice more in San Francisco, then retired from the field rich for me, and laid out a plan to sail westward from San Francisco and go around the world. The proprietors of the Alta engaged me to write an account of the trip for that paper, 50 letters of a column and a half each, which would be about 2,000 words per letter, and the pay to be $20 per letter. I went east to St. Louis to say goodbye to my mother, and then I was bitten by the prospectus of Captain Duncan of the Quaker City excursion, and I ended by joining it. During the trip, I wrote and sent the 50 letters, 6 of them miscarried, and I wrote 6 new ones to complete my contract. Then I put together a lecture on the trip and delivered it in San Francisco at great and satisfactory pecuniary profit. Then I branched out into the country and was aghast at the result. I had been entirely forgotten. I never had people enough in my houses to sit as a jury of inquest on my lost reputation. I inquired into this curious condition of things and found that the thrifty owners of that prodigiously rich Alta newspaper had copyrighted all those poor little $20 letters and had threatened with prosecution any journal which should venture to copy a paragraph from them. And there I was. I had contracted to furnish a large book concerning the excursion to the American Publishing Co. of Hartford, and I supposed I should need all those letters to fill it out with. I was in an uncomfortable situation. That is, if the proprietors of this stealthily acquired copyright should refuse to let me use the letters. That is just what they did. Mr. Mack, something, I have forgotten the rest of his name, said his firm were going to make a book out of the letters in order to get back the $1,000 which they had paid for them. I said that if they had acted fairly and honorably, and had allowed the country press to use the letters or portions of them, my lecture skirmish on the coast would have paid me $10,000, whereas the Alta had lost me that amount. Then he offered a compromise. He would publish the book and allow me 10% royalty on it. The compromise did not appeal to me, and I said so. I was now quite unknown outside of San Francisco. The book's sale would be confined to that city, and my royalty would not pay me enough to board me 3 months. Whereas my Eastern contract, if carried out, could be profitable to me, for I had a sort of reputation on the Atlantic seaboard acquired through the publication of 6 excursion letters in the New York Tribune and 1 or 2 in the Herald. In the end, Mr. Mack agreed to suppress his book, on certain conditions, In my preface, I must thank the Alta for waiving rights and granting me permission. I objected to the thanks. I could not, with any large degree of sincerity, thank the Alta for bankrupting my lecture aid. After considerable debate, my point was conceded, and the thanks left out. 1902, 1904, 1897. Noah Brooks was the editor of the Alta, at the time, a man of sterling character and equipped with a right heart, also a good historian where facts were not essential. In biographical sketches of me written many years afterward, 1902, he was quite eloquent in praises of the generosity of the Alta people in giving to me without compensation a book which, as history had afterward shown, was worth a fortune. After all the fuss, I did not levy heavily upon the Alta letters. I found that they were newspaper matter, not book matter. They had been written here and there and yonder, as opportunity had given me a chance working moment or two during our feverish flight around about Europe, or in the furnace heat of my stateroom on board the Quaker City. Therefore, they were loosely constructed, and needed to have some of the wind and water squeezed out of them. I used several of them, 10 or 12 perhaps. I wrote the rest of The Innocents Abroad in 60 days, and I could have added a fortnight's labor with the pen and got along without the letters altogether. I was very young in those days, exceedingly young, marvelously young, younger than I am now, younger than I shall ever be again, by hundreds of years. I worked every night from 11 or 12 until broad day in the morning, and as I did 200,000 words in the 60 days, the average was more than 3,000 words a day. Nothing for Sir Walter Scott, nothing for Louis Stevenson, nothing for plenty of other people, but quite handsome for me. In 1897, when we were living in Tedworth Square, London, and I was writing the book called Following the Equator, my average was 1,800 words a day. Here in Florence, 1904, my average seems to be 1,400 words per sitting of 4 or 5 hours. I was deducing from the above that I have been slowing down steadily in these 36 years, but I perceive that my statistics have a defect. 3,000 words in the spring of 1868, when I was working 7 or 8 or 9 hours at a sitting, has little or no advantage over the sitting of today, covering half the time and producing half the output. Figures often beguile me, particularly when I have the arranging of them myself, in which case the remark attributed to Disraeli would often apply with justice and force. There are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. Dictated January 23, 1907. The proverb says that Providence protects children and idiots. This is really true. I know it because I have tested it. It did not protect George through the most of his campaign, but it saved him in his last inning, and the veracity of the proverb stood confirmed. 1865. I have several times been saved by this mysterious interposition, when I was manifestly in extreme peril. It has been common, all my life, for smart people to perceive in me an easy prey for selfish designs, and I have walked without suspicion into the trap set for me, yet have often come out unscathed, against all the likelihoods. More than 40 years ago, in San Francisco, the office staff adjourned, upon conclusion of its work at 2 o'clock in the morning, to a great bowling establishment where there were 12 alleys. I was invited, rather perfunctorily, and as a matter of etiquette, by which I mean that I was invited politely, but not urgently. But when I diffidently declined, with thanks, and explained that I knew nothing about the game, those lively young fellows became at once eager and anxious and urgent to have my society. This flattered me, for I perceived no trap, and I innocently and gratefully accepted their invitation. I was given an alley all to myself. The boys explained the game to me, and they also explained to me that there would be an hour's play, and that the player who scored the fewest 10 strikes in the hour would have to provide oysters and beer for the combination. This disturbed me very seriously, since it promised me bankruptcy, and I was sorry that this detail had been overlooked in the beginning. But my pride would not allow me to back out now, so I stayed in, and did what I could to look satisfied and glad I had come. It is not likely that I looked as contented as I wanted to, but the others looked glad enough to make up for it, for they were quite unable to hide their evil joy. They showed me how to stand, and how to stoop, and how to aim the ball, and how to let fly, and then the game began. The results were astonishing. In my ignorance, I delivered the balls in apparently every way except the right one. But no matter. During half an hour, I never started a ball down the alley that didn't score a 10 strike, every time at the other end. The others lost their grip early, and their joy along with it. Now and then one of them got a 10 strike, but the occurrence was so rare that it made no show alongside of my giant score. The boys surrendered at the end of the half hour, and put on their coats and gathered around me and in courteous, but sufficiently definite, Language expressed their opinion of an experience-worn and seasoned expert who would stoop to lying and deception in order to rob kind and well-meaning friends who had put their trust in him under the delusion that he was an honest and honorable person. I was not able to convince them that I had not lied, for now my character was gone, and they refused to attach any value to anything I said. The proprietor of the place stood by for a while saying nothing. Then he came to my defense. He said, "It looks like a mystery, gentlemen, but it isn't a mystery after it's explained. That is a grooved alley. You've only to start a ball down it any way you please, and the groove will do the rest. It will slam the ball against the northeast curve of the head pin every time, and nothing can save the 10 from going down." It was true. The boys made the experiment, and they found that there was no art that could send a ball down that alley and fail to score a 10 strike with it. When I had told those boys that I knew nothing about that game, I was speaking only the truth. But it was ever thus, all through my life. Whenever I have diverged from custom and principle and uttered a truth, the rule has been that the hearer hadn't strength of mind enough to believe it. 1873. A quarter of a century ago, I arrived in London to lecture a few weeks under the management of George Dolby, who had conducted the Dickens readings in America 5 or 6 years before. He took me to the Albemarle and fed me, and in the course of the dinner, he enlarged a good deal, and with great satisfaction, upon his reputation as a player of 15-ball pool, and when he learned by my testimony that I had never seen the game played, and knew nothing of the art of pocketing balls, he enlarged more and more, and still more, and kept on enlarging, until I recognized that I was either in the presence of the very father of 15-ball pool, or in the presence of his most immediate descendant. At the end of the dinner, Dolby was eager to introduce me to the game, and show me what he could do. We adjourned to the billiard room, and he framed the balls in a flat pyramid, and told me to fire at the apex ball, and then go on and do what I could toward pocketing the 15, after which he would take the cue and show me what a past master of the game could do with those balls. I did as required. I began with the diffidence proper to my ignorant estate, and when I had finished my inning, all the balls were in the pockets, and Dolby was burying me under a volcanic eruption of acid sarcasms. So I was a liar in Dolby's belief. He thought he had been sold, and at a cheap rate, but he divided his sarcasms quite fairly and quite equally between the two of us. He was full of ironical admiration of his childishness and innocence in letting a wandering and characterless and scandalous American load him up with deceptions of so transparent a character that they ought not to have deceived the house cat. On the other hand, he was remorselessly severe upon me for beguiling him, by studied and discreditable artifice, into bragging and boasting about his poor game in the presence of a professional expert disguised in lies and frauds, who could empty more balls in billiard pockets in an hour than he could empty into a basket in a day. In the matter of 15-ball pool, I never got Dolby's confidence wholly back, though I got it in other ways and kept it until his death. I have played that game a number of times since, but that first time was the only time in my life that I have ever pocketed all the 15 in a single inning. 1876. My unsuspicious nature has made it necessary for Providence to save me from traps a number of times. 30 years ago, a couple of Elmira bankers invited me to play the game of Quaker with them. I had never heard of the game before, and said that if it required intellect, I should not be able to entertain them. But they said it was merely a game of chance, and required no mentality, so I agreed to make a trial of it. They appointed 4 in the afternoon for the sacrifice. As the place, they chose a ground-floor room with a large window in it. Then they went treacherously around and advertised the sell which they were going to play upon me. I arrived on time, and we began the game, with a large and eager free list to superintend it. These superintendents were outside, with their noses pressed against the window pane. The bankers described the game to me. So far as I recollect, the pattern of it was this: they had a pile of Mexican dollars on the table. 12 of them were of even date, 50 of them were of odd dates. The bankers were to separate a coin from the pile and hide it under a hand, and I must guess odd or even. If I guessed correctly, the coin would be mine. If incorrectly, I lost $1. The first guess I made was even, and was right. I guessed again, even, and took the money. They fed me another one, and I guessed even again and took the money. I guessed even the fourth time and took the money. It seemed to me that even was a good guess, and I might as well stay by it, which I did. I guessed even 12 times and took the $12. I was doing as they secretly desired. Their experience of human nature had convinced them that any human being as innocent as my face proclaimed me to be would repeat his first guess if it won, and would go on repeating it if it should continue to win. It was their belief that an innocent would be almost sure at the beginning to guess, even and not odd, and that if an innocent should guess even 12 times in succession and win every time, he would go on guessing even to the end. So it was their purpose to let me win those 12 even dates and then advance the odd dates, one by one, until I should lose $50 and furnish those superintendents something to laugh about for a week to come. But it did not come out in that way. For by the time I had won the 12th dollar and last even date, I withdrew from the game because it was so one-sided that it was monotonous and did not entertain me. There was a burst of laughter from the superintendents at the window when I came out of the place, but I did not know what they were laughing at nor whom they were laughing at, and it was a matter of no interest to me anyway. Through that incident, I acquired an enviable reputation for smartness and penetration, but it was not my due, for I had not penetrated anything that the cow could not have penetrated. Mark Twain. To be continued. Footnote. North American Review. Number DCXX. August 2, 1907. Chapters from My Autobiography, Roman 21. By Mark Twain. From Sussie's Biography of Me. Feb 1286. Mama and I have both been very much troubled of late, because Papa, since he has been publishing Jen Grant's book, has seemed to forget his own books and work entirely. And the other evening, as Papa and I were promenading up and down the library, he told me that he didn't expect to write but one more book. And then he was ready to give up work altogether, die, or do anything. He said that he had written more than he had ever expected to, and the only book that he had been particularly anxious to write was one locked up in the safe downstairs, not yet published. But this intended future, of course, will never do. And although Papa usually holds to his own opinions and intents with outsiders, when Mama really desires anything and says that it must be, Papa always gives up his plans, at least so far, and does as she says is right. And she is usually right if she disagrees with him at all. It was because he knew his great tendency to being convinced by her that he published without her knowledge that article in the Christian Union concerning the government of children. So, judging by the proofs of past years, I think that we will be able to persuade Papa to go back to work as before and not leave off writing with the end of his next story. Mama says that she sometimes feels, and I do too, that she would rather have Papa depend on his writing for a living than to have him think of giving it up. Dictated November 8, 1906. I have a defect of a sort which I think is not common. Certainly, I hope it isn't. It is rare that I can call before my mind's eye the form and face of either friend or enemy. If I should make a list, now, of persons whom I know in America and abroad, say to the number of even an entire 1,000, it is quite unlikely that I could reproduce 5 of them in my mind's eye. Of my dearest and most intimate friends, I could name 8 whom I have seen and talked with 4 days ago, but when I try to call them before me, they are formless shadows. Jean has been absent, this past 8 or 10 days, in the country, and I wish I could reproduce her in the mirror of my mind, but I can't do it. It may be that this defect is not constitutional, but a result of lifelong absence of mind and indolent and inadequate observation. Once or twice in my life it has been an embarrassment to me. 20 years ago, in the days of Sussie's biography of me, there was a dispute one morning at the breakfast table about the color of a neighbor's eyes. I was asked for a verdict, but had to confess that if that valued neighbor and old friend had eyes, I was not sure that I had ever seen them. It was then mockingly suggested that perhaps I didn't even know the color of the eyes of my own family, and I was required to shut my own at once and testify. I was able to name the color of Mrs. Clemens's eyes, but was not able to even suggest a color for Jean's or Clara's or Sussie's. All this talk is suggested by Sussie's remark. The other evening, as Papa and I were promenading up and down the library, down to the bottom of my heart I am thankful that I can see that picture. And it is not dim, but stands out clear in the unfaded light of 21 years ago. In those days, Sussie and I used to promenade daily up and down the library, with our arms about each other's waists, and deal in intimate communion concerning affairs of state, or the deep questions of human life, or our small personal affairs. It was quite natural that I should think I had written myself out when I was only 50 years old, for everybody who has ever written has been smitten with that superstition at about that age. Not even yet have I really written myself out. I have merely stopped writing because dictating is pleasanter work, and because dictating has given me a strong aversion to the pen, and because 2 hours of talking per day is enough, and because, but I am only damaging my mind with this digging around in it for pretexts where no pretext is needed, and where the simple truth is for this one time better than any invention, in this small emergency. I shall never finish my 5 or 6 unfinished books, for the reason that by 40 years of slavery to the pen, I have earned my freedom. I detest the pen, and I wouldn't use it again to sign the death warrant of my dearest enemy. Dictated March 8, 1906. For 30 years, I have received an average of a dozen letters a year from strangers who remember me, or whose fathers remember me as boy and young man. But these letters are almost always disappointing. I have not known these strangers nor their fathers. I have not heard of the names they mention. The reminiscences to which they call attention have had no part in my experience. All of which means that these strangers have been mistaking me for somebody else. But at last I have the refreshment, this morning, of a letter from a man who deals in names that were familiar to me in my boyhood. The writer encloses a newspaper clipping which has been wandering through the press for 4 or 5 weeks, and he wants to know if Cap Tancred, lately deceased, was, as stated in the clipping, the original of Huckleberry Finn. I have replied that Huckleberry Finn was Frank F. As this inquirer evidently knew the Hannibal of the 40s, he will easily recall Frank. Frank's father was at one time town drunkard, an exceedingly well-defined and unofficial office of those days. He succeeded General Gaines, and for a time he was sole and only incumbent of the office. But afterward Jimmy Finn proved competency and disputed the place with him. So we had 2 town drunkards at one time, and it made as much trouble in that village as Christendom experienced in the 14th century when there were 2 popes at the same time. In Huckleberry Finn, I have drawn Frank exactly as he was. He was ignorant, unwashed, insufficiently fed, but he had as good a heart as ever any boy had. His liberties were totally unrestricted. He was the only really independent person, boy or man, in the community, and by consequence he was tranquilly and continuously happy, and was envied by all the rest of us. We liked him, we enjoyed his society. And as his society was forbidden us by our parents, the prohibition trebled and quadrupled its value, and therefore we sought and got more of his society than of any other boys. I heard, 4 years ago, that he was justice of the peace in a remote village in the state of, and was a good citizen and was greatly respected. During Jimmy Finn's term Jimmy, was not exclusive, he was not finical, he was not hypercritical, he was largely and handsomely democratic and slept in the deserted tan yard with the hogs. My father tried to reform him once but did not succeed. My father was not a professional reformer. In him the spirit of reform was spasmodic. It only broke out now and then with considerable intervals between. Once he tried to reform Injun Joe. That also was a failure. It was a failure, and we boys were glad. For Injun Joe, drunk, was interesting and a benefaction to us, but Injun Joe, sober, was a dreary spectacle. We watched my father's experiments upon him with a good deal of anxiety, but it came out all right, and we were satisfied. Injun Joe got drunk oftener than before and became intolerably interesting. I think that in Tom Sawyer, I starved Injun Joe to death in the cave. But that may have been to meet the exigencies of romantic literature. I can't remember now whether the real Injun Joe died in the cave or out of it. But I do remember that the news of his death reached me at a most unhappy time. That is to say, just at bedtime on a summer night, when a prodigious storm of thunder and lightning, accompanied by a deluging rain that turned the streets and lanes into rivers, caused me to repent and resolve to lead a better life. I can remember those awful thunderbursts and the white glare of the lightning yet, and the wild lashing of the rain against the window panes. By my teachings, I perfectly well knew what all that wild riot was for. Satan had come to get Injun Joe. I had no shadow of doubt about it. It was the proper thing when a person like Injun Joe was required in the underworld, and I should have thought it strange and unaccountable if Satan had come for him in a less impressive way. With every glare of lightning, I shriveled and shrunk together in mortal terror, and in the interval of black darkness that followed I poured out my lamentings over my lost condition, and my supplications for just one more chance, with an energy and feeling and sincerity quite foreign to my nature. But in the morning, I saw that it was a false alarm, and concluded to resume business at the old stand, and wait for another reminder. The axiom says, history repeats itself. A week or 2 ago Mr. Blank Blank dined with us. At dinner he mentioned a circumstance which flashed me back over about 60 years, and landed me in that little bedroom on that tempestuous night, and brought to my mind how creditable to me was my conduct through the whole night, and how barren it was of moral spot or fleck during that entire period. He said Mr. Ten was sexton or something of the Episcopal Church in his town, and had been for many years the competent superintendent of all the church's worldly affairs, and was regarded by the whole congregation as a stay, a blessing, a priceless treasure. But he had a couple of defects, not large defects, but they seemed large when flung against the background of his profoundly religious character. He drank a good deal, and he could outswear a brakeman. A movement arose to persuade him to lay aside these vices, and after consulting with his pal, who occupied the same position as himself in the other Episcopal church, and whose defects were duplicates of his own and had inspired regret in the congregation he was serving, they concluded to try for reform, not wholesale, but half at a time. They took the liquor pledge and waited for results. During 9 days, the results were entirely satisfactory, and they were recipients of many compliments and much congratulation. Then on New Year's Eve, they had business a mile and a half out of town, just beyond the state line. Everything went well with them that evening in the barroom of the inn, but at last the celebration of the occasion by those villagers came to be of a burdensome nature. It was a bitter cold night, and the multitudinous hot toddies that were circulating began by and by to exert a powerful influence upon the new prohibitionists. At last Ten's friend remarked, "Ten, does it occur to you that we are outside the diocese?" That ended reform number one. Then they took a chance in reform number two. For a while that one prospered, and they got much applause. I now reach the incident which sent me back a matter of 60 years, as I have remarked a while ago. One morning, Mr. Blank Blank met 10 on the street and said, "You have made a gallant struggle against those defects of yours. I am aware that you failed on number one, but I am also aware that you are having better luck with number two." "Yes," 10 said, "number two is all right and sound up to date, and we are full of hope.